Jeff Bezos, the man who could buy this entire restaurant without thinking twice, was just told he wasn't allowed inside, not because he couldn't afford it, not because of security concerns. The reason was something no one saw coming. The air inside the restaurant shifted. Conversations slowed. People turned their heads, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. The staff stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Employees whispered. A few customers discreetly lifted their phones, sensing that something big was unfolding. But the most shocking part was Bezos himself. There was no outrage, no demand to speak to the owner, no threats of lawsuits or social media takedowns. He just stood there, calm as ever, his expression unreadable. It was almost like he was processing something deeper, something far bigger than just being turned away from a restaurant. While everyone else was waiting for a reaction, Bezos was already 3 steps ahead. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it changed everything. It was a crisp afternoon, the kind where the sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the towering skyline. The city hummed with energy, business districts alive with movement, high-powered executives rushing between meetings, deals being closed over firm handshakes and expensive espresso shots. For most, it was just another workday, another cycle of ambition and endless schedules. But for Jeff Bezos, today was different. There were no board meetings, no calls with investors, no high-stakes negotiations waiting for his signature. Today wasn't about business. Today was about something far more valuable than money. It was about a promise. Years ago, long before Amazon became an empire, before private jets and space rockets, there was just Jeff and his closest friend. Back then, they were nobodies. Just 2 guys chasing success, fueled by ambition, long nights and cups of cheap coffee in a cramped office with flickering lights. They didn't have wealth, connections, or a safety net, just an idea, a dream, and the relentless drive to turn it into something real. And in one of those late nights between frustration and hope, they had made a pact. One day, when we've made it, we'll have lunch at one of the nicest restaurants in the world. No stress, no work, just us reflecting on how far we've come. At the time, it seemed like a distant fantasy. Back then, they weren't the type of people who had lunch in the finest establishments. They were too busy grinding, surviving, pushing forward. But now, years later, the world had changed. Jeff had built something that redefined modern business. His name had become a symbol of power and innovation, and the life that once seemed out of reach was now his everyday reality. But despite everything he had built, there was one thing that hadn't changed: his word. That promise still mattered, and today, he was going to keep it. For an occasion like this, only the best would do. The restaurant they had chosen wasn't just another high-end eatery, it was an institution. The kind of place that didn't need to advertise, didn't need flashy signs or promotions. It thrived on secrecy, on exclusivity, on being inaccessible to nearly everyone. This was where the world's most powerful figures dined in complete privacy, where conversations worth billions took place over handcrafted plates of food that looked more like art than meals. Perched atop a luxury skyscraper, it was designed not just to be a restaurant, but a sanctuary for the elite. There was no number to call, no website to book a table. Reservations didn't exist here. You didn't get in by requesting a seat, you got in by being invited. This was a place for the inner circle, a world where entry wasn't about wealth alone, but about legacy, reputation, and power. The clientele wasn't just rich, they were history makers, royalty, Fortune 500 CEOs, Hollywood legends, political leaders, people whose last names alone could open doors. Privacy was paramount. Thick tinted windows shielded the diners from the outside world, while security ensured that no uninvited guest ever made it past the entrance. Inside, there were no loud conversations, no distractions. Every detail was designed to create an experience that was as much about power as it was about indulgence. The wine lists weren't printed on paper, but displayed on tablets encased in leather. The cutlery wasn't stainless steel, but custom-made, crafted from rare metals. The food wasn't just a meal, it was a performance. Every dish was curated by world-renowned chefs, flown in from different corners of the world. For most people, stepping inside was impossible. This wasn't just about having money. This was about belonging to a world that few even knew existed. But for Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, the architect of modern e-commerce, a man whose influence stretched across industries and continents, getting inside should have been effortless, or so he thought. As Bezos approached the entrance, something felt off. The usual seamless luxury, the effortless transition from outside to inside wasn't happening. The moment he stepped forward with his guests, guest. The hostess at the podium hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the screen in front of her, her eyes flicking up to meet his for just a second before quickly shifting elsewhere. It was a brief moment barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but for someone like Bezos, who had spent his life studying people, understanding power dynamics, and reading between the lines, it was enough. There was no immediate greeting, no polished welcome like the other guests before him had received. Instead, the woman's posture stiffened, and she subtly turned her head toward the manager standing a few feet away. A silent signal, a request for direction, the kind of moment that happened when something wasn't going according to plan. Bezos waited. He didn't say anything, didn't press, didn't make a scene. He simply stood there, watching, observing every detail. The shift in the room, the barely there murmur between staff, the stolen glances from other guests who had already noticed that something wasn't right. Finally, after what felt longer than it should have, the hostess cleared her throat and straightened up. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Bezos, but we won't be able to seat you today." Her voice was smooth, polite, but there was no warmth in it, no explanation, no apology, just a carefully structured sentence designed to put up a wall without leaving room for argument. Bezos didn't react. He didn't frown, didn't demand an answer. He simply let the words settle for a moment before responding in the same calm, measured tone he always used. "That's strange," he said evenly. "We confirmed the reservation earlier today." His assistant, standing just behind him, was already pulling up the email. A few taps on the screen, and the glowing confirmation was right there. Date, time, and name all displayed in plain sight. He held it up, offering undeniable proof that everything was exactly as it should be. The hostess barely glanced at it. Her expression didn't change. The wall stayed up. "I'm really sorry," she repeated. The same tone, the same script. "There's nothing I can do." That's when it became obvious. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a scheduling issue. This wasn't about availability. It was about something else entirely. Because as Bezos stood there waiting for a real answer, another group approached the entrance. A well-dressed man in a tailored suit, his wife beside him draped in understated elegance. No reservation, no checking the system. And yet, without hesitation, the hostess smiled, nodded, and motioned for them to follow her inside. No delays, no hesitation, no rejection. The doors that had just been shut in Jeff Bezos' face had swung wide open for someone else. Bezos didn't move. He didn't step back. He didn't argue. He simply watched as the couple disappeared behind the velvet curtain, escorted without question into the very space he had just been denied. His expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture shifted. A realization, a quiet understanding of what was happening. It wasn't about the reservation. It wasn't about capacity. It wasn't even about him. It was about the unspoken rule that places like this operated under. A rule that wasn't written on any official policy, yet dictated everything. A presence approached from the side, quick, cautious. A waiter, young, nervous, glancing over his shoulder before leaning in just enough for his words to be heard. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They don't think you belong here." Bezos didn't flinch. He didn't need to ask what that meant. The message was crystal clear. This wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about status. It wasn't even about power. In this world, their world, he was still an outsider. He had built one of the largest companies on the planet. He had reshaped entire industries, changed the way people lived, worked, and shopped. His name was synonymous with innovation, with success, with dominance. And yet, none of that mattered here, because this wasn't about achievements. It was about heritage, legacy, the invisible lines that separated the self-made from the born into it, the ones who earned their way in from the ones who had always belonged. The room felt even quieter now. Conversations that had once been effortless now felt strained. Eyes flickered toward him, subtle but present. They were waiting for something, an outburst, a demand for answers. A billionaire throwing his weight around, forcing his way through the door like money had always allowed him to do. But Bezos didn't give them that. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for the manager. He didn't threaten lawsuits or public fallout. Instead, he smiled, just slightly, just enough for those watching to wonder why. Because at that moment, Bezos wasn't thinking about the door that had just been shut in his face. He was already thinking about the next one he was about to build. Bezos remained still, his gaze lingering on the entrance for just a moment longer. The message had been received loud and clear, but he wasn't the type to dwell on rejection. There was no point in arguing, no need to prove anything. He had spent decades mastering the art of power, not by forcing his way through doors, but by owning the buildings they were attached to. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. A few swipes, a quick scan of his contacts, and then a single call. No raised voice, no urgency, just a calm exchange of words. Those watching had no idea who was on the other end, but the shift in energy was undeniable. The manager, who had been standing nearby, stiffened as his own phone buzzed against across his hip. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen, and instantly, his face drained of color, a hesitation, a flicker of panic. Then, in a heartbeat, everything changed. The once dismissive posture vanished. The fake professionalism was replaced with nervous energy. He hurried forward, suddenly eager, suddenly desperate to fix what had just happened. The same man who had been indifferent just minutes ago now couldn't stop apologizing. "Mr. Bezos, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding. There must have been a mistake. If you'll allow me, we'd be honored to offer you our finest table, private dining, the best service, anything you need." His words spilled out quickly, the kind of overcompensation that came from someone realizing they had just made a career-altering mistake. Bezos listened, expression neutral, nodding slightly as if considering the offer. The staff held their breath. The guests who had been watching from their tables leaned in slightly, waiting to see if he'd take the bait, if he'd accept the sudden change of heart and sit down like nothing had happened. But Bezos didn't take the bait. He turned to his friend, the one he had promised this lunch to all those years ago, and with the same calm confidence he had walked in with, he smiled and said, "We're going somewhere better." No anger, no grand speech, just a decision. And with that, he put his phone back in his pocket, turned around, and walked away, leaving the restaurant scrambling to pick up the pieces of the mistake they could never take back. As Bezos and his friend walked away, the staff stood frozen, the manager still muttering apologies to an empty space. But the real damage hadn't even started yet. Unbeknownst to them, the entire exchange had been captured on camera. Someone sitting near the entrance, a silent observer, had recorded everything. The hesitation, the denial, the sudden shift when the phone call happened, and Bezos's effortless dismissal of their desperate attempt to backtrack. By the time Bezos stepped into his car, the footage was already making its way online. A single post, a short clip, a caption that said everything without needing much context. They really turned Jeff Bezos away, and then panicked when they realized who they just rejected. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Business leaders, influencers, and everyday people alike reacted with disbelief. The restaurant, once known for its exclusivity, was now infamous for something else entirely: outdated elitism, gatekeeping, and a system that even one of the richest men in the world couldn't bypass. The backlash was swift. Executives who had once proudly dined there began distancing themselves. High-profile investors quietly withdrew their support. The brand that had spent decades building a reputation of untouchable prestige was now drowning under a wave of public scrutiny. Articles were written. Think pieces debated what true exclusivity meant in a changing world, and former employees started coming forward with their own stories about how the restaurant operated behind closed doors. And yet, through all of it, Bezos remained silent. No statement, no comment. He didn't need to say anything. He had seen it happen time and time again. Places, companies, even entire industries that clung to outdated ideas of power and access, thinking they were immune to change. But the world didn't work that way. Not anymore. A week later, his move was announced. No press conference, no dramatic reveal, just a simple but powerful announcement. A new restaurant, a new concept, a place that didn't define exclusivity by legacy or privilege, but by what you've built, what you've created, what you've contributed to the world. It wasn't just another fine dining experience. It was a space designed for visionaries, innovators, disruptors, the ones who had earned their place, not through old money or last names, but through ideas, perseverance, and impact. There were no secret lists, no memberships based on who you knew. It was a place where the next generation of history makers could sit together, share ideas, and forge something bigger than themselves. The launch was an instant success, not just because of Bezos's name, but because of what it represented. The world was evolving, and so were the spaces that defined success. Celebrities, tech moguls, artists, and entrepreneurs flocked to it, not just for the food, but for the message behind it. It was a symbol of a new era, and the original luxury diner, the one that had built itself on being untouchable, it faded into irrelevance. Because when the world is changing, the places that refuse to change don't stay on top, they get left behind. When Bezos was finally asked about the incident, his response was simple. True exclusivity isn't about keeping people out, it's about creating something worth being part of. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. Success isn't just about wealth, it's not about status, legacy, or being part of an exclusive club that decides who gets in and who stays out. The real power isn't in sitting at someone else's table, it's in building your own. Jeff Bezos didn't fight to prove he belonged. He didn't beg for a seat in a place that had already decided he wasn't one of them. Instead, he walked away and built something better. And in doing so, he proved a simple but undeniable truth. When the world evolves, the spaces that refuse to change get left behind. So the question isn't whether you have access, it's whether you have the vision to create something that people want to be part of. Because true exclusivity isn't about keeping others out, it's about building something so valuable, so forward-thinking, that people can't ignore it. If this story resonated with you, if it made you rethink power, success, and what it really means to belong, then make sure to share this video. Let's start a conversation about what the future of success looks like, and why it belongs to the ones who create, not just the ones who inherit. And if you want to hear more stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because the world is changing, and those who pay attention, they'll be the ones shaping what comes next.